All right, so we're diving into Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living today. Looks like you're ready to tackle worry head on, and we're here to help you find those, most effective tools from this classic.
Yeah, how to stop worrying and start living. It's a practical guide, right? Not just theory about worry. What's really cool about how Carnegie approaches it is it's like a hands-on toolkit, right?
Yeah.
He pulls from all of these real-life stories and experiences, makes it feel, relatable and actually something you can use.
It really is, and that mix of personal stories and advice is what makes it so compelling.
Yeah.
He doesn't just talk about worry as this abstract thing. He shows you how it affects people's lives, which makes it hit home harder.
One thing that really got me was how he tackles the cost of worry head on. Like right off the bat, there's this stat that makes you think 70% of patients going to doctors could cure themselves just by getting rid of worry.
70%. Wow, that's huge. It really shows how much worry is tied to our physical health, wouldn't you say?
For sure. He links worry to all these real physical problems like ulcers, heart issues, high blood pressure, can't sleep. He even suggests, that chronic worry might be a factor in worse mental health issues too. And it's not just him saying it. He uses vivid examples,
Hmm.
like General Grant instantly cured of this awful headache the moment Lee surrendered.
That's a great example of how the mind and body are connected. Makes you wonder how many of our physical problems actually come from worry and stress.
Exactly. Carnegie's point is clear. This isn't some abstract concept. Worry has a real impact on our lives.
One of the most interesting ideas he brings up is this living in day-tight compartments. It's fascinating how it keeps us from being swamped by the past and the future.
It's about putting all your energy on right now, the only place we can really control. Instead of getting stuck in regrets or freaking out about what might happen, Carnegie's saying focus on what you can do right now.
He tells this great story about Mrs. E.K. Shields. Almost gave in to despair after her husband died. But she consciously chose to live one day at a time, and it gave her the strength to rebuild her life. What's amazing is how, even in deep grief, focusing on the present moment can be such a powerful step towards healing.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we often make ourselves suffer by dwelling on things we can't control. This day-tight compartments thing, it's like what Sir William Osier said famously, live in day-tight compartments.
Yeah.
Every day is a fresh start, right? You can refocus, rebuild.
It's like that Robert Louis Stevenson quote. Anyone can carry his burden, however hard, until nightfall. Anyone can do his work, however hard, for one day. We're capable of so much more than we think when we break things down into smaller pieces.
And that leads to another big principle of his, action as the antidote. He lays out this simple but profound thing about the mind. You can't think about two things at once.
So if we're doing something meaningful, we can push worry out. It's like giving our minds a new, better thing to focus on. But wouldn't that just be a temporary fix? Does action really deal with the root of the worry?
Great question. That's where the psychology comes in. This principle uses something called cognitive displacement. If you're doing a demanding task, something that needs focus and thought, you're basically reducing the mental space worry has. It's not just distraction, it's like shifting mental gears.
I get it. Like the story of the grieving father who found peace building a toy boat for his son. It wasn't just keeping busy, it was channeling his energy into something creative and meaningful.
Exactly. It wasn't passive distraction. It was an active process that needed focus and skill. It's kind of like what Carnegie called occupational therapy. The idea that work itself can be like an anesthetic for the mind.
So it's not about just staying busy, right? It's about choosing activities that need real focus and thought. Activities that pull you in and don't leave room for worry.
Right on. And talking about action, Carnegie talks about Willis H. Carrier's magic formula for facing the worst. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, don't you think?
Yeah, at first glance. Tell me about this magic formula. How is facing the worst a good way to deal with worry?
Well, the smart thing about it is that it goes right at the heart of worry, the fear of the unknown. By mentally preparing ourselves for the absolute worst outcome, we take away its power. We're not stuck in what ifs anymore.
So it's about moving from fear and uncertainty to a place of control, even if that control is accepting a tough outcome.
Exactly. Carrier has a three-step process. First, look at the situation clearly, no emotions clouding your judgment. Then, prepare yourself mentally to accept the absolute worst that could happen. And finally, calmly work to make that worst-case scenario better.
I can see how that would be empowering. Instead of stressing over what might happen, you take steps to prepare and maybe even lessen the damage.
And this isn't just theory. Carrier himself used this exact method to save his company from going bankrupt. It shows how powerful, clear, focused action can be, even when things look disastrous.
Wow. that's incredible. It really shows that sometimes the best way to beat fear is to face it head on. Now, this next idea is really interesting. Using statistics to fight worry. Carnegie calls it the law of averages.
This is where things get cool. Carnegie says we often think bad things are way more likely to happen than they really are, and that makes us more anxious.
So it's about looking at the real data, being objective, instead of letting our fears control how we see things.
You got it. He uses some great examples, like comparing the chances of being killed by lightning versus dying between 50 and 55 years old. Spoiler alert, you're way more likely to die from the second one.
Great example. It shows how our fears aren't always based on what's likely to happen. We worry about things that are statistically pretty unlikely.
He also talks about how safe those tankers carrying highly flammable stuff are, even though people think they're dangerous. It's about knowing what's a real concern and what's just, unfounded fear.
And he tells the story of Jim Grant, the guy who sold oranges, constantly worried about his shipments getting messed up in accidents.
Right, until he looked at his records and realized that out of thousands of shipments, only a tiny fraction had ever had problems.
So interesting. It shows how just having a bit of objective perspective can be incredibly calming.
By understanding this law of averages, we can start to challenge those worries and base our view of the situation on reality. So next time a worry starts to spiral, stop and ask yourself, what does the data actually say about how likely this is to happen?
It's about trading emotional reasoning for an approach based on evidence. I can definitely see how that's valuable. Now, talking about changing perspectives, let's talk about gratitude. Carnegie emphasizes how appreciating what we have can be a powerful way to stop worrying about what we don't have.
It's a classic way to reframe things, and he uses some amazing stories to show how powerful it is. For example, he tells the story about Harold Abbott meeting a man with no legs.
I remember that one. It instantly changed how Abbott felt about his own money problems. It's amazing how seeing someone else be strong in the face of hardship can make our own worries seem smaller.
It reminds us that what we see as lack often depends on our perspective. Like Schopenhauer said, we seldom think of what we have, but always of what we lack.
That quote really hits home because I catch myself doing that all the time. How do you personally fight that tendency to focus on what's missing instead of what you have?
Well, for me, it's about actually practicing gratitude. Taking a few minutes every day to think about the things I'm grateful for, no matter how small they might seem. It's about switching my focus from what I don't have to what I do have.
That's a great practice. It goes perfectly with Eddie Rickenbacker's story. He survived this crazy ordeal at sea and learned a profound lesson about appreciating the simple things in life.
He realized that fresh water, food, shelter, things we often take for granted, are the foundation of a good life. By recognizing how much we already have, we can feel content, and that naturally pushes back against worry.
It reminds us that being content isn't about having everything you want, it's about appreciating what you have. And that brings us to a really interesting idea, turning criticism into growth. Tell me more about Carnegie's FTD folders.
FTD stands for Fool Things I Have Done, and it's basically a system for writing down and analyzing your own mistakes to help you grow faster.
So it's a way to be critical of yourself before anyone else can be. But wouldn't focusing on past mistakes lead to more self-doubt? How does Carnegie deal with that?
That's a good point. Carnegie isn't saying you should dwell on your mistakes or beat yourself up about them. It's about taking responsibility for your mistakes, learning from them, and using that knowledge to get better.
So it's about moving from being defensive to being curious and always wanting to improve.
You got it. He talks about H.P. Howell, a successful financier, who set aside time each week to review what he did, find his mistakes, and learn from them.
It's like creating a personal library of wisdom through self-reflection. Now, I see how this would be useful for someone in a leadership position, but how would this FTD method work for someone who's not making big decisions all the time?
Well, the principle works for anyone who wants to grow and improve, no matter what they do. It's about being self-aware and being willing to learn from your mistakes, big or small.
It's a powerful concept. Imagine doing this yourself. How could looking at your own shortcomings actually make you more confident and resilient when people criticize you? It seems counterintuitive, but maybe by facing our mistakes head-on, we take away their power.
That's a great insight. By owning up to our imperfections, we actually become less vulnerable to what other people say.
And by acknowledging our mistakes, we get the chance to learn and grow from them, turning something potentially negative into a positive. This is fascinating stuff.
Absolutely. And this is just the start of what Carnegie has to offer.
I'm excited to explore more of his insights and stories.
Let's dive in.
It's amazing how he mixes these practical techniques with inspiring stories from real life. These stories make the book come alive and show us that these principles aren't just theories, they're being used by real people, right?
Yeah, it reminds us we're not the only ones struggling with this. Tons of other people have dealt with worry and come out stronger. Carnegie gives all these great examples of how people conquered worry and turned their lives around. Want to explore a few.
For sure. What stories really stood out to you?
Well, I was really struck by Professor William Lyon Phelps' account of how he beat worry. He was this famous Yale professor who shared 5 powerful strategies all about taking action, both mentally and physically.
And his first point was live with gusto and enthusiasm, right? It seems counterintuitive, like just changing your attitude could really impact worry that much.
Yeah, but Phelps believed that if you embrace life with excitement and a sense of wonder, it could actually fight off those worrisome thoughts. He argued that worry and enthusiasm can't exist at the same time in your mind.
Interesting. So it's about actively building a positive mindset, not just waiting for worry to disappear. Did he give any examples of how this worked in his own life?
He did. He shared how even when he was in serious pain from his eyes, he felt total relief when he was giving a lecture to his students. His mind was so engaged, so into the topic, that the physical pain just went away.
That's amazing. It shows how much our mental state can affect our overall well-being. Makes you think maybe we give our worries too much power by focusing on them instead of focusing on something we're passionate about.
Totally. It's about shifting your focus from the problem to the solution, from the worry to the thing that brings you joy and keeps you engaged. Phelps also talked about how reading could crowd out worry. He found comfort and escape by immersing himself in interesting books, especially when stressed or sick.
I get that. A good book can take you to a different world. Give your mind a break from daily worries. It's like hitting a reset button for your mental state.
Exactly. And besides mental engagement, Phelps also thought physical activity was key to fighting depression and anxiety. He believed in pushing himself physically, like working up a good sweat, and literally feeling those negative emotions leave his body.
Like taking that nervous energy and putting it into something good and productive. Instead of letting worry eat you up, you use that energy to fuel physical activity, which has its own benefits. What other strategies did he have?
His last point was about the importance of patience and perspective. He reminded himself that most worries tend to just fade over time. He encouraged a more laid-back approach, living in the present instead of stressing about the past or worrying about the future.
That's powerful, but it's not always easy to do, is it? Sometimes those worries feel so urgent and overwhelming that it's hard to step back and get some perspective.
It takes practice for sure. And speaking of overcoming what seemed like impossible challenges, J.C. Penney's story is a powerful example of how giving yourself over to something bigger than yourself can work.
Yeah. His story is incredibly moving. He talks about hitting rock bottom, feeling totally lost and alone, completely swallowed up by worry and despair. It's hard to imagine someone so successful going through such tough times.
It shows that even people who seem to have it all can struggle with worry and self-doubt. You know, what's inspiring is how he found his way out of that darkness. It was when he was at his lowest, listening to a hymn in a small chapel, that he had this profound experience. He felt this overwhelming sense of God's love and support, and it totally changed his outlook.
He realized that he wasn't alone in his struggles, and that surrendering, not resisting, was the way to peace. It reminds us that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is let go of our need to control everything and just trust that something bigger is at play.
It's about finding that strength and resilience inside us that we all have, even when we feel broken.
And then there's Percy H. Whiting's story, which gives a lighter take on beating worry.
Oh, yeah. Whiting was a total hypochondriac. He thought he had every illness in the book. But what's funny is how he finally beat his worry by learning to laugh at himself.
He realized that he couldn't worry and laugh at those worries at the same time. It's like choosing to see your problems in a more playful way, which can be really disarming. It's hard to take your worries too seriously when you're laughing at them.
Exactly. And by doing that, he broke free from those negative thought patterns that were causing him so much stress.
His story is a good reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with worry is to lighten up a bit. Sometimes a little humor and being kind to yourself can go a long way.
Definitely. And then we have Reverend William Wood's story, which has this powerful metaphor for letting go of regrets about the past and anxieties about the future.
Oh, yeah. He learned something valuable from watching his wife wash dishes, something that seems so ordinary but held a deep insight.
He noticed that his wife had this simple but effective way of washing dishes. She only did one day's worth at a time.
That's brilliant. She didn't get overwhelmed by thinking about all the dishes she'd have to wash in her lifetime. She just focused on what was right in front of her.
And that made Reverend Wood think about his own worries in a new way. He learned to crumple up yesterday's anxieties and throw them away mentally.
It's about realizing that dwelling on the past won't change it, and worrying about the future won't stop it from happening. The only time we have real control is right now.
Right. And by putting our energy into the present moment, we can free ourselves from carrying all those unnecessary worries around.
It's another example of living in day-tight compartments, just like Carnegie talked about.
Exactly. And then there's Louis T. Monton Jr.'s story. It shows how even the most crippling worry can be overcome with a little patience and a change of perspective.
For years, he was paralyzed by anxiety, worrying about everything: his job, his health, how he interacted with people. It's hard to imagine living with that constant anxiety.
But he learned a valuable lesson from a friend who had gone through so much, but stayed incredibly cheerful and resilient.
What was that lesson?
His friend told him to write down all his worries and then stick them in a drawer for a couple of weeks.
Interesting. So it's about creating some space between you and those worries and letting time do its thing.
Exactly. The idea is to acknowledge the worries, but not let them take over. By putting them aside, you make room for other thoughts and feelings.
And when Louis looked at those written worries again after a few weeks, he realized they didn't have the same power over him anymore.
Time had either solved the problem or changed his perspective, letting him see things differently. It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with worry is to just wait and trust that things will eventually work out.
It's like that saying, "This too shall pass." Sometimes we just need a little time and distance to see things more clearly and objectively.
And sometimes, as time goes by, we find solutions we couldn't have even imagined when we were in the middle of it all.
These stories are so powerful. They really show that worry is something everyone experiences, and there are tons of ways to overcome it.
They offer a glimpse into the human spirit's ability to adapt, evolve, and find peace, even when things are tough.
And they show how powerful it can be to share our stories and learn from each other's experiences. It's comforting to know we're not alone in our struggles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But while these stories give us inspiration and hope, Carnegie doesn't stop there. He also gives practical advice on how to actually use these principles in our own lives.
That's what makes this book so useful. It's not just about feeling inspired, it's about actually doing something to create lasting change.
You got it. He gives us a map for changing our relationship with worry and finding peace of mind again.
I'm excited to dig into more of his insights and see how we can apply them to our own lives.
Let's jump back in.
It's really incredible how these stories show how powerful it can be to change your perspective even when you're facing huge challenges.
Yeah, totally. It's about choosing to focus on what we can control, like our thoughts, actions, and attitude, and letting go of the rest.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into how to stop worrying and start living, what are the key takeaways that you think will be most helpful for our listeners as they try to deal with their own worries?
Well, first of all, Carnegie reminds us that worry is a choice. It's not something that just happens to us. It's a habit. And with effort and the right tools, we can break free from it.
And he gives us a whole bunch of practical techniques to do just that. We talked about living in day-tight compartments, keeping busy with purposeful action, and even facing the worst-case scenario head-on.
Remember, Carrier's magic formula for saving his company. It's about shifting from fear of the unknown to a place of control.
Right. By accepting the worst-case scenario, we can actually make it less scary and think more strategically. But Carnegie goes beyond just practical techniques, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He emphasizes how important it is to change our perspective on a deeper level, whether it's understanding the law of averages, being grateful for what we already have, or even seeing criticism as a chance to grow. He encourages us to look at our challenges in a whole new way.
And speaking of embracing criticism, I keep thinking about that FTD folder idea. It seems so counterintuitive, but so powerful. What do you think is the biggest thing holding people back from trying that technique?
I think it's the fear of judgment, from ourselves and from others. We're so scared to admit our mistakes that we end up just repeating them.
That makes sense. But like Carnegie says, even geniuses like Einstein admitted they were wrong most of the time. It's about understanding that mistakes are a natural part of learning.
Exactly. It's about moving from a mindset of trying to be perfect to a mindset of always trying to improve. And by owning up to our imperfections, we actually become less sensitive to what other people think of us.
It's like we take the power away from criticism by admitting it before anyone else can.
Exactly. And maybe the most important takeaway from Carnegie's work is recognizing that our thoughts create our reality.
He really emphasizes that our minds have a huge influence on our experiences.
By choosing to focus on the positive, the hopeful, the things that empower us, we can literally change our lives. This is even more important today than ever. With the world constantly throwing information and stimulation at us, finding inner peace and building resilience is so important.
Couldn't agree more. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, but I think there's one question that's still out there. What happens when we try these techniques, but worry still sneaks in? How do we deal with those stubborn anxieties that just don't seem to make sense?
That's a really good question, and it's something I struggle with too. I think it's important to remember that progress isn't always a straight line. There will be setbacks, and there will be days when worry just feels overwhelming.
So it's about being kind to ourselves and not getting down on ourselves when we don't meet our own expectations.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about understanding that worry is a habit. And just like any habit, it takes time and effort to break.
It's like we wouldn't expect to run a marathon after just one day of training, right? We can't expect to get rid of worry overnight either.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. So as we leave our listeners to think about these powerful ideas and start their own journey toward a life less burdened by worry, I want to leave them with one final thought-provoking question.
I'm listening.
Think about the biggest worry you have right now, the one that keeps you up at night or distracts you during the day. Now, of all the techniques and stories we've talked about, which one feels the most counterintuitive to apply to that worry?
That's such a great question. It really makes us step out of our comfort zones and consider new ways of tackling our problems.
Exactly. It's about realizing that sometimes the best solutions are the ones that at first seem the most uncomfortable or don't make sense.
So, to everyone listening, I'd say, embrace that discomfort. Go for the techniques that challenge your way of thinking. Experiment, play around, explore. You might be surprised by what you find.
We've given you a look at some powerful tools for beating worry. Now it's time to use them and create a life with more peace, joy, and fulfillment.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone. Carnegie's wisdom, along with the inspiring stories of all those people who have overcome worry, can be your guide and your compass.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, we hope you find peace in the present moment and the courage to face whatever challenges come your way.